Hello, Brody.
Hello. How's it going?
It's good. It's good. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you.
Okay. The funny thing is when you start recording, it becomes stale as fuck instantly.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, it's because I have to second guess what I'm about to say.
So, for anyone who's not aware, who are you and what do you do?
My name's Brody Simpson, and I play and record drums. I mean, I do other things as well. I've just started golfing. I'm into hand tool woodworking. I've just ordered Japanese sharpening stones.
Wow. You're doing all the manly stuff.
Well, no, I'm not doing any of it yet. I just want to start doing it, and so I'm buying everything to facilitate the hobby. I haven't had a hobby. So, but for the most part, I'm a drummer and I record drums and I produce artists locally in Perth, Western Australia.
So for me, if I were to describe you, my follow-up question to you getting a lot of like weird gear and knives and like power tools would be like, oh, so you're going to use that for sort of weird percussion. Because what you're sort of, if you're on Instagram, you should have noticed Brody's excellent output of left field beat making. That's you are playing organic drums, but you are in very specific ways making it sound like they're not organic drums or not even drums.
Yeah. I'm trying to, in real time, be samples, basically.
Right.
Is kind of what I'm getting at most of the time. So, like, yeah, everything I do is all drum sounds that I've kind of pulled in my drum room, but for the most part, I've then pulled in plugins afterwards. But every single time, it's the sound that I recorded, just mangled and manipulated, and not replaced with something that already sounds that way. Not for any,
Right.
There's no principle behind that. It's more that I just find it challenging to do it myself. So it's the long way of doing it. It's a really terrible idea, but yeah, that's pretty much what I do.
We haven't had this conversation, so this is not something I know. That's why I'm asking. I'm just curious, like, what is your sort of musical taste background, and what have you been listening to and been inspired by to come to where we're at?
It's weird because the stuff that I do, like especially in my videos you'd see on Instagram, is not really what I listen to at all, or have really dedicated a whole lot of time to listening to. I mean, Death Cab for Cutie are one of my favorite bands of all time. I come from like a rock background, so like, my favorite bands growing up were Soundgarden and Pearl Jam and Nirvana, and then stuff like Green Day and The Offspring and that sort of stuff when the punk thing sort of started to become a thing in the 90s. So yeah, so I don't really come from that thing at all. And then later in life I started listening to like Björk and a little bit of kind of electronic stuff, but for the most part I still don't really listen to that stuff. Maybe more recent years Kendrick Lamar, Run the Jewels. But yeah, people assume that I'm just going to say Jay Dilla.
Right.
And it would make sense, yes. I don't and haven't really ever listened to Dilla. I mean, every time I hear Dilla, I go, "Oh, this is excellent," but it's just not really been, my thing. I don't know. It's probably a good idea I haven't, because I would just be straight ripping Dilla off, as opposed to inadvertently, indirectly ripping Dilla off.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've talked to other people about this as well. I think like the best stuff coming out, regardless of genre, is usually the people that aren't like knee deep in said genre. It's people who are just like taking a truckload of like influences from here and then doing this thing. I think that's when it usually becomes more interesting. Because I mean, if you listen to, say, Run the Jewels, you can hear a lot of different shit in there. It's like, it's not weird to me at all that they have like Zach De La Rocha or Roca.
I've never known.
All right, I'm gonna Google that later.
Oh, hi. This is Zach De La Rocha speaking. How are you?
Anyways, the singer from Rage Against the Machine, and also like Josh Homme from Queens of Stone Age and Kaya's, having them as people like that they are handpicking to be on their album doesn't feel weird to me, because when I hear that like their drum production and everything around, it feels like, yeah, I'm definitely hearing like Kaya's and Soundgarden and like Rage Against the Machine in 100%. There. It's just like it's just filtered through their like mindset.
Yeah, for sure. There's no shortage of influences happening in every one of their tunes.
But I mean, so that's why I really wanted to pick your brain on how sort of, without like stealing the sauce, because that's not what we're doing here. But it's more like I'm just trying to figure out like where you start out with from both idea and then sort of processing after recording the drums. And also, I mean, you must have come sort of full circle where you record drums intentionally in a way, knowing that I'm gonna mangle them in this fashion later.
For sure. Yeah, so it's the whole thing's a big feedback loop. Like every element of the process informs and is informed by another element of the process. So I set up raw sounds to be vaguely in a particular direction, and then I play around with those sounds for a little while, and that starts to inform a part, and then that part I hear the possibility for the raw sounds to take a slightly different direction, so I adjust them. That then informs the part, and the part gets refined a little bit more, and then I'll like record a snippet of it, come back into the control room and listen, and then I'll start doing a bit of a mix on it to a point where I could still play through that mix like in real time. And then once those sounds are happening there and I'm listening to like a bit of the sort of first or second iteration of the idea, that will start to show me, okay, well, if I played it this particular way, the sounds could be manipulated in this particular way. And if I simplify the part here, or if I play this phrase differently, or if I'm a little lazier, or, you know, I'm a little more displaced, or my hats are a little bit later and a little bit weirder, it's going to do this. The whole thing is just like, it's every single time it evolves from I sit behind a drum set and there's some raw sounds that are, you know, not typical drum sounds, but still do sound somewhat like drums in a room. And then it goes through a process over the course of like an hour or two of getting to a point where I'm like, okay, I'm honing a part now, and the sounds are going to work for the part in this particular way, and the part is going to work for the sounds in this particular way. All that to say that I should probably just find a much quicker, better way of doing it.
But I mean, you do have... I mean, why we started talking was not really because you were using our stuff. It was just mainly because I was a fan. And then I threw RC20 at you and also our DS10 drum shaper. And from what I've understood, at least, is they've worked their way into that sort of gumbo of plugins and shit you're using.
Yeah, RC20 in particular, DS10 sort of comes out much more sort of in a much more utilitarian kind of manner. But RC20, like I immediately throw that on the drum bus before I do anything, because I know that I want to track through it with the tube saturation turned up a bit, at least that.
It lives on the master then.
Yeah, it sits on the drum bus, before I'm tracking, because I use it as like an overall tone shaping on the drums that I track everything into, and then eventually, most of the time, you'll see in this session, it ends up making its way onto every individual track as well.
Right. Can we just open up a session and look at it?
We should. Definitely should. Let's.
Just like any good sort of cooking program, you're bringing out the bowls where you're like, and I have this prepared, and you actually have the pie is already in the oven. It's done.
It's baking. Yeah. It is on the sill, and you are about to cartoonishly float towards it. There it is.
Wow, what a nice pie. I can't believe you have done that already.
I present to you a pie. That's half a pie right there.
That's a good half. It's going to keep me full all day. We need to actually just start talking about one of your signature moves. The party trick that Brody calls it is this thing. For a dummy like me, you're doing something to the hi-hat where it sounds like it's reversed, but you're doing it in real time. Talk about that.
So it's, I guess, a hi-hat swipe is what a lot of people call it. I just basically rest kind of like the stick just above my hand. I rest that on the side of the hi-hat and then very violently swipe downwards. And as that happens, releases a bit of pressure on my foot. The hi-hat kind of opens, but like you're bowing a violin string almost. So it opens with like a long attack. There's a reverse envelope to it compared to what would normally happen if you were to strike a drum. And that sounds like a reverse hi-hat. It just sounds like a reverse cymbal, and so I just do that because unfortunately I can't in real time play reverse things. God, I wish I could play reverse things. Well, other elements of the kit, it would be really nice. I stole it from a fantastic drummer called Lionel Lewis, who plays with Snarky Puppy. He was the first person I ever saw do it, and I stole it from him, and I do try and tell everyone that asks me about it that I did steal it from him. Because, credit where credit's due. It's kind of become, it's the party trick. It's become a bit of a signature move.
Did you name it, though, or did someone else call it the party trick?
I call it the party trick. I don't know that anyone else calls it the party trick. Other than actually probably just myself and you are the two main people that call it the party trick.
And now the rest of the internet.
And now everyone else, yeah.
It's still a very bespoke, cool thing, and I think you're adding your own flavor to it. Because if you just hear a beat that you made, that sounds definitely like, oh, here they chopped up a thing and just put it in a reverse. It's like, that would be an editing thing.
That's very much how I'm trying to use it, is like in like a turnaround or something, like this. In a turnaround like that, because I want it to sound like someone has grabbed a whole bunch of different sounds, chopped them together into a cool, interesting thing, and then inserted that as the fill in a groove.
Right.
Which is why I quite often will surround it with other sounds that are only happening in that instance in the groove.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, throw some effects and stuff on it. There's some cool stuff happening on that hi-hat swipe currently.
While we're talking about it, let's look at what you got going.
Okay, so, this is the swipe. I always separate it from the actual hi-hat track because it needs extra sauce. So that's the hi-hat track and the swipe. So, the big thing that's happening here is this guy.
You're using the wobble?
I use the wobble on everything. And I use it for stereo widening. Pretty much.
Oh, cool. All right, because back in the day when we released RC20, I sat in conversation with the producer Illmind.
Right,
and he was calling it like the dead frog effect.
Sounds like a dead frog now.
If you use too much, it just sounds like a dead frog. I don't really know what that means, but it means it doesn't maybe sound better if you crank it, I guess. It can go too much, but okay, so this is actually interesting because what you're saying is something that people usually miss out on, is that it can be used as a stereo widener rather than just like blah, 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 blah.
So this is the drum bus. I actually have a very small amount of the wobble as a stereo widener on the entire drum bus mixed in at a few percent. Yeah. I use it for that because I like the fact that you can do some kind of fake stereo widening stuff with it in a more modulation-y way that doesn't sound like an 80s bass chorus. Like so much like stereoing sounds like pretty cheesy, whereas this, you can actually kind of give it a little bit more badassery.
Can you bring that up again so we can like listen to it with and without?
Yeah, for
just
sure.
So people can get like the flavor of what it actually does.
Yeah, I'll show the hi-hat swipe with and without the wobble.
Yeah.
So when it's set like that, it's set completely to wow, and the rate is turned down quite low, but it's like dimed at the actual amount. It's almost more like a auto panning. You actually hear that really move across the stereo field.
Yeah, that's the nice thing about what you can see, like the visual feedback up top.
Yeah.
Again, when you, like Brody says, when you move it into like just the wow section and not having flutter mixed in, that's how I use it as well. Because for me, I don't want that sort of the wobbly stuff going on really, or like the overly like just, I don't know, like someone just doing this on a vinyl record while you're playing it. It's just like there's too much tonal difference. Just rather would want movement. You can do the same thing with, if you just want movement, you can do that with magnetic as well, but then you're not actually pitch shifting stuff, you're just using it with volume. It's much more minute, but it is a really good way to like just to get a little bit of width.
So yeah, I mean that's kind of the crux of that thing. I mean, it's very subtle on the drum bus.
But again, it's sort of the stacking of everything that does the thing in the end. And I know you're sort of more than pretty much anyone else. You are about the details.
Yeah. Annoyingly so. Yeah.
If we're moving to something more where people can like hear a drastical change.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, I'll show you. I'm actually using it on the kick. So this sound here, most of that sound is I've duplicated the snare bottom mic and I have just absolutely blitzed it.
Because it is kind of aggressive.
So that's where most of that kick sound is coming from. So that's the kick coming through the snare bottom mic, getting absolutely destroyed. So doing the old trick of just, I mean, obviously a kick in a snare bottom mic is not a super strong signal. So absolutely blitzing it into RC20, then distortion the entire way up. On the iron type, because it's a very different breakup to the tube when I'm trying to do that thing. And then adding a very short, very focused reverb to it. So I mean, I can show you that sound without RC20, which is just basically a turned up snare bottom mic, the bleed of a kick drum in a turned up snare bottom mic, but all of a sudden
it's like a firing squad.
It's insane, right? And that's because my favorite part of a kick drum sound is its bleed in the snare bottom mic. It's such a great way of getting presence and kind of like mid-range forwardness in a kick sound.
Wow.
But, you know, it's really hard to turn that up.
Now you're giving people the sauce.
Yeah, look, I'm getting too much sauce. Hey,
too much sauce.
Let's make this thing bone dry. No more sauce for you. But like all the other plugs that are actually happening on that channel, like it's just basically like stuff that I've copied across because I duplicated the snare bottom track. Pretty much the entirety of that sound is just coming from RC20 doing.
That is awesome though.
Yeah, I know, right? How underwhelming is that without just destroying it through?
It feels like the difference between when your angry neighbor knocks the first time and then like the 10th time when you haven't opened the door. You're just like...
Yeah, pretty much.
You're going to open when you hear that. Or maybe you shouldn't. Call the police instead. Wait, I was meaning to show you something. Bring that up again, because I'm going to show you a sort of hidden feature.
Okay.
If you want to crank the input, but you don't want to crank the output, because RC20 can definitely, you can clip your output like a lot if you're not...
Pretty easily.
What you can do is if you hold down, I think it is Option on Mac at least. Command, all right, and you dial in the gain. It's actually going to do the reverse on the master one.
I'm doing it right here.
If you like what the distortion, for example, is doing, or the noise or whatever, it is a great way of just feeding like more into RC20, but then at the same time dialing back the output.
That is normally how I would do it, is to raise them both. To do them in conjunction with each other. The reason I didn't do that on this one is because it's the bleed of a kick drum and a snare bottom mic. So there's not a whole lot of signal happening there. It desperately needed to be absolutely like, I mean, this isn't the gain on the way into RC20 is not the thing that's blitzing that sound. It's basically the thing that's making that sound loud enough for the distortion to then do its job.
I guess the lesson here is listen to your input and mind your outputs.
Yeah, very much so.
You said you had it on everything. We've looked a little bit at weird mics, but like then your meat and potato stuff, like your regular kick mic, your regular snare mic. What's happening there?
Okay, cool. So I'm running a couple of kick mics on this one, and one of them, which is a great sounding kick mic, and I've just done this thing where I've like turned what is a great sounding kick mic into this.
Okay.
because it needed that.
Kick mic manufacturer is weeping.
Yeah. Yeah, so sorry, that's Dr. Alien Smith, who is L Smith, a local Perth guy. That's the Alien 8 kick mic, which everyone is using now because it's fantastic. But I happened to choose this time to not use it to its actual potential and turn it into that pokey little mess. But this is the RC20 chain that I have on that kick mic, in order to do that and to make that.
Guide us through the choices here, because now you got like digital going and a lot of stuff.
Yeah. So digital gets a lot of use on sounds where I'm actually trying to add attack. I kind of use it like as a clipper, to add attack to something. So you can see that I'm only, using just the top end within the focus. That's one of my favorite things about RC20, man. It's the focus section of each of these modules. So I'm only doing that. I'm smoothing it out a little bit so it's not like the most abrasive sound you've ever heard. So it's not doing like a crazy amount on this kick, but what it's doing is it's through like the bit crushing sort of side of that. It's just actually taking a little bit of the bottom end away from it and adding like a little bit of like a sort of, I mean, it's digital attack is all I can describe it as, which is what I quite often use it for. I do the same thing on snare bottom mics fairly regularly. The wobble, again, in stereo, mixed in just the tiniest little bit. It is very subtle.
Yeah, because when you see that, like the waveform up top, it's just like it's going absolutely bonkers. But then you see the little mix like dial down there. You're literally like at what 2-3% or something like that. I
think it's about as low as I can get it. I couldn't even tell you how low it is. It would be 1 to 3%, somewhere in that range.
That is just for a little bit of movement.
Just a little bit of movement, just so that the kick isn't. Because I mean that's like, the bulk of the kick sound is not that sound, so that's just to give like a little bit of interest to the kick, so it's not sort of sitting quite so boxy and static in the middle.
So it's essentially like you're just after the fact adding, like if you would have room mics for the kick separately or something like that, just to get like a little bit of something happening. Yep.
So quite often with like the shorter sort of less bottom heavy, less boomy kick sound, I will add a little bit of this reverb to it, and then shape it with the focus to create almost like, the sound of the kick in the room, but almost like more the kind of papery sort of front. If you were to have like a front head with no hole, like a really thin front head, like that kind of papery sound, which you can hear.
Right. Oh, definitely.
So that almost sounds like the flappiness of a bass drum skin.
Yeah, we're going from like dry to Bonham pretty much.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, and then obviously the distortion.
One of my favorite drum mixers, he just calls it the bloom, or like the breath of the drum, where it's just like the thing that comes after the first transient that makes it sound like a drum in a room.
Yeah, are you talking about Eric Valentine?
No, you don't know about this guy, but okay. But I think most good drum mixers are like chasing that exact thing. But this is Daniel Lidin, who he has done a lot of like stoner rock and heavier stuff. He is just a drum god when it comes to mixing, and his specialty is just like, even though you have guitars and everything drowning it out, like walls and walls of distortion, he anyways makes the kick sound like it's on a separate channel somehow, where it's just like, whew, you're getting that sort of just the just propulsion of air, which is, I mean, if you listen to who did it first, like Bonham, why that works with Led Zeppelin is basically because they're writing the riffs and everything around that. The kick is sort of, everyone's a rhythm section really, where like the riff is actually not playing when you get like that kick sound. That's why you can hear like the like breath of the kick. It's because no one is actually playing on that hit. It's not like the constant just like drone guitar, but we've evolved into that now with like modern heavy music. It is just like a complete wall of guitars and bass, and to be
everything always playing at the same time.
Yeah, and to be able to penetrate that is just like really like trying to break physics, because that's not how audio works.
Well, that's the thing. That's why you need to have so much top end in the kick drum sounds for that kind of music, whereas this is all about adding like that kind of more subtle kind of boxy mid-range, which is like a
Yeah.
forwardness as opposed to an attack. It's like it's it's a different thing. It's almost like more like a breathiness and a pressure as opposed to a plasticky clickness.
Yes.
Clickness, there you go, that's a word.
I mean, I love heavy music, but I've sort of chased my entire life trying to get the sound of just drums soloed, but
Yeah.
with all the other stuff on top, because it doesn't really mix. That's why I love hearing your beats, because it's like, you can hear everything, and you get that sort of like being in the room with the drummer feel, and the second you start putting stuff on top, you are going to lose some aspects of that, like the feel of the drums or the sort of bloom in the mix. And that's when you start to need to process the living shit out of things.
Yeah. Yeah, look, I think my mixes for my videos, I think if you were to put like a dense track on top of them, you'd need to smash the drums a bit harder again. So I'm sort of riding that middle ground of like, I'm going super hard in the paint for particular sounds.
Mm-hmm.
But I also do want it to not just sound like a distorted, compressed mess. Like I'm really going for like very fine control, which, like I say, if you were to put like a massive buzzing synth on top and a whole bunch of vocal layers and that sort of stuff, you'd probably need to push the drums a little harder to get them to hold their weight in the mix. But, you know, as it stands, they're on their own currently. So
Right.
I'm still very much mixing for that.
You're like just locked into an eternal drum solo.
Does anyone need any other instruments?
Not really. I mean, hey, I work at Excellent Audio for a reason. I'm complete, utter fool and drum nerd. Let's move out of the nerdery and into even more nerdery, I guess. We were talking about the snare, I guess. We've been below it, which is, again, I think this is a lesson for people when they think drums. Don't use a lot of like close mics if you want it to sound like a drum kit. That's if you want it to be like metal or whatever, but and have that attack. But usually what you like about drums is when you're standing a couple of meters away and it's just like what comes into your ears. Yeah. I talked to the drummer from the Hives, the rock band, fellow Swedes, and we talked about their breakout album, Vinny Vidi Vicious, where apparently like he just wanted, like, I wanted it to sound like the way it does where I sit when I play. So they had a very, very minimalist approach to miking the kit there, and that's why it sounds like a drum kit. I just think they have like one big mic sitting right here, sort of, and then maybe like the kick and some overheads.
I go about that in a much more indirect way, where I start by trying to make it sound like only individual elements, and using like, I mean, this is the only ambient mic I have, which is the overhead sound. Turning that into the overhead mic, it's just a mono overhead mic, just turning that into its own little sort of reverb effect. But the reason I then end up putting so much like crazy processing on things like the kick drum, putting its own reverb that's tuned to a very specific frequency, is because I'm trying to make that sound like it was a kick drum sample from a record that had its own overhead mic, had its own ambience on it. Same deal with that kick sample, which just so happens to be the snare bottom mic, is it has its own space again, because I want it to sound like a collection of samples that are taken from, disparate places, other records, weird different things. So yeah, I'm going for absolute control. The hi-hat mic has reverb on it with a really hefty pre-delay, so it sounds like it's slapping off a wall, but in a different room to the rest of the track.
Oh, okay.
Pretty subtly in that instance.
Right, but I mean, also something I noticed is that you got this sort of slight flanging sound to a lot of your like top end stuff and cymbals.
Yeah, because I love the sound of it. It's almost maybe more of like a drum and bass kind of ethos, where you've got the top layer of the kit is like the break that was pulled off a record, and then the kick and snare are like massive samples that you've you've quantized the break and then you've got a program kick and snare. They happen to be sitting there, and then you've high-passed the shit out of the break, and it's kind of all messy and warped, and it's been warped into time and quantized and whatnot, and that's kind of like the top line of the whole kit thing, and that's very much what I do with hi-hat mics, quite often with overhead mics and ride mics as well. And that's why I really like the more obvious kind of wow and warpiness on those sounds, because it's just another layer of like, okay, well, maybe that's the thing that was pulled from the old fucked record.
Right, because when people listen to your breaks on Instagram or whatever, you can definitely, you're not playing like a ride or cymbal that like a wash. You're never really doing that. It's more like on the 1 or the 3 or whatever you put it. But then you can, if people listen to it, they can definitely hear like the wow. That's sort of like the movement we're talking about.
Case in point.
Yeah. And if we're listening to that clean, how would that, just so people, for reference.
With no RC20? Sounds like someone hitting the bell of a crash cymbal, which is what it is. It's not, it's a pretty boring sound. I mean, in context without RC20, I guess.
I mean, it's cool.
It's a vibe still, but
yeah, but the what you're doing is just intentionally making it sound like a sample plucked out of somewhere else and put in there that has this sort of like, it's just a weird warping whatever on it.
And very much so in this case with the noise set to 100% follow.
Oh, okay. Tell me about like your thought process there.
I basically use the noise as its own ambience or its own reverb or its own, in the way like back in the day, like that kind of classic triggering, opening a gate on some white noise to to beef up a snare sound. It's that, but I just do it on everything. And so in this case, the noise is acting as almost like it's a noise reverb, essentially, a noise ambience for the ride cymbal. Because without it, it's adding like it really, to me, does sound like a tuned reverb. I mean, there is also a reverb on it. No, ride close mics do not deserve this level of attention, for God's sake.
But you're here to save the ride mics of the world.
I mean, ride close mics on their own. I mean, do we want to lift the entire veil? This is nothing on the ride close mic.
That's a cool sounding ride, though.
Well, it's a crash cymbal. It's a
it's a crash. Okay,
yeah.
Because I've heard a lot shittier close mic rides.
That was actually not. It was nowhere near as shit as I was hoping it would be. So I take that back. That's that's a good ride mic sound.
No, but usually for people who don't mix drums, close mic on the ride is usually like, I'll take that down. Because it's not the most fun thing to listen to.
In any context of a normal drum sound where I'm like, on a session where I'm like kind of actually riding on a ride cymbal, the ride close mic is there purely for a little bit of directionality to move the ride to the side a little bit further. And that's all it's there for. It's not there so that you get a nice ride sound, because it's not a nice sound.
Yeah, because again, we're talking about more drum philosophy, but don't start thinking about like, I need like the most mics for a drum sound, for it to sound like drums at least.
Yeah.
It's like, what do drums sound like when you're standing next to it? You're just having a stereo pair of mics and you're being somewhat like a couple of meters away from it. It's not very often that people go up and listen to the ride like this. Where it's just like,
it's really
that's the thing I'm after, like just the bell right here. If like the roomy or like real drums is what you're after, then again, don't use a lot of close mics. Think more of the room. Try to make it sit. If you want it to sound like individual samples, do like Brody. But it all starts to like, you need to think before you do to end up where you want to be.
There's a lot of intention behind every step of the process for this stuff for me. Because like it is a really cool sound to just throw a few mics on a kit and then just like distort and compress the shit out of those mics. Like that's a fun sound. And it does work in, many instances, but that's not what I'm trying to do.
No, right.
I just want it to be a much more refined, kind of controlled, like very deliberate. Every single element of the kit very deliberately has its own thing happening.
It was fun to see you talk about this follow function, because I actually did like a small tutorial on exactly that, where just thinking about like noise tails, when you're actually working with one-shot samples or like these sort of little items lifted out of their context, and if you're in that situation and you want it to sit a little bit better in the mix, this follow function making you dial in just how much of a tail you want, so you have no noise coming until you have input, essentially.
Yeah.
And then you can define how long of a tail you have afterwards, which is really what happens. If you just hit a snare in a room, you're going to have like initial hit and then a sort of clinging out of the sound. Without having to throw like reverbs or other stuff on it, you can just like create a more like natural sounding tail, which is used by many but isn't talked about enough.
It's such a great function for the noise. Like, that's how I use it. The noise becomes like, it's not a constant thing. It becomes like a programmable effect. I actually have just remembered that I had, at one stage, I actually had noise on the drum bus. I think I may have just turned the module off a little while ago and forgotten to turn it back on. But I've actually got it on the full drum mix, ducking. So, side chaining to the drum mix. But with a hint of follow so that it isn't ducking quite so hard. Yeah, I actually quite like that. I'm turning that back on. That's staying on. I just need to turn it down a little bit.
The difference between follow and duck and why they actually work together is duck essentially takes your input, and then just like whenever you have a kick going in or a loud sound, it actually will then duck down the noise, which would happen if you were having a recording with noise in it that you compressed. Then it's like between the hits you would get like this sort of the noise going up and down, but with the follow on top of that as well, you still get like a little bit of a smoother experience. Why we even put like noise in RC20 is because usually when people have done it manually, you would just have this sort of like noise or static or whatever in a separate track, and then you would have to sidechain it because you wanted that sort of the kick or something else to move it up and down, and so it felt like it was glued to the mix. And that is essentially what the duck function does.
Yeah.
For you, without having to do all the boring manual setup.
That noise thing, it gets used a lot. My favorite, one of my favorites is the Apollo, because it's just, well, I don't want to change that setting. I like that setting. Just because it has like a note to it. And with the tone, you can kind of tune it a little bit, and that's a huge vibe for that sort of thing. But yeah, the noise, man, I think it's great, and I like that it's just adding some much needed RMS to an otherwise collection of disparate sounds.
Yeah, it just everything just sits.
I like it a lot.
I think people are more hip to it now, but before RC20 and everyone just putting noise on everything, that can definitely go too far. But I mean, it is very much like the whole evolution of us making everything cleaner and cleaner and more digital, and we did lose that glue where like everyone gets nostalgic about like, oh, that tape or that old shitty thing, or where it's like it actually sounds worse, but somehow I like it more, and why? Yeah. And if you scratch that a little bit, it's usually because we don't like to hear like complete silence. That is weird to us. It's like going into one of those, like, I don't know if you've seen those chambers where they have created like complete silence, where
anechoic.
Like
yeah.
People go, like, they don't like being in there for a reason. It's because it's just like it is too dead in there, and you start to hear like your inner bodily organs.
Yeah, you hear your own pulse, and you hear
Yeah. I think we're just naturally tuned to wanting to have, like, I don't know, a little bit of hearing the ocean, a little bit of hearing the breeze in the trees. So just having a little bit of, like, just noise in the background of anything just makes it feel like, oh, now it's just alive, and it feels like a part of the world.
It puts it in an environment as opposed to it being a collection of ones and zeros. Like, it actually puts it into the real world somewhere. Yeah, it's one of those things where you don't know it's there until you take it out, and then you go, why did everything fall apart? What's happening?
Hence the RC20 and everything.
Exactly.
Like, just a little bit of that.
I mean, look, here's an instance of me just using it for a little bit of tone. This is the kick out mic. All I'm doing there is just adding some of that kind of... So what I find is, like, on a kick sound, I do a lot of finding stuff I don't like and pulling it out to really control the sound, and shortening it, to really get more control over the sound. And then once I've done that, the more kind of surgical, subtractive stuff, I want to then add an element back in. And normally the surgical subtractive stuff is low mid stuff and mud and stuff that's really kind of like clouding the mix and not allowing room for anything else. But then I want to add some of that back in, because it is still an important part of the sound, but I want to do it with a broader stroke, and that's where I quite often like to use the tube pair type distortion, because it adds mid-range and low mid, but in a just a much more musical fashion, as opposed to the resonances of a kick drum microphone. As opposed to, like, it's not a proximity effect. It's, something kind of getting hot and fuzzy. Hot and fuzzy, is that a thing? Hot and fuzzy. Hot and fuzzy.
It is now.
Yeah, this beat is now called Hot and Fuzzy. I think kind of the same deal with the snare top mic. Same deal. Just a whole bunch of the tube and then dialing the top end back up again. Let's turn that noise off. That's why I turned the noise off before, because every time I tried to solo something... There we go. Okay, hold on. That's the thing that I did that I'd forgotten that I'd done, is I, in this turnaround, I automated the space, the little individual reverb that I have on the snare. I automated that to turn off, to add like a little bit of like a slightly anechoic chamber kind of claustrophobic thing to the couple of snare hits after the turnaround. I'll show you what I mean there. Really subtle, kind of like just making it so that you're like, it's almost like you've leaned into the snare drum. Like, you've heard that turnaround, you've gone, hey, what's going on there? And you kind of lean in a little bit closer. You're not hearing as much environment around it. You did
the patented Peter listen to the ride, but
exactly, the old ear on the ride bell, eh? And a lot of that kind of distortion sound that you're actually hearing on that snare mic. Look, it's inside baseball now. A lot of that distortion sound, that kind of like weird kind of crunchy thing. That is an entirely analog effect of putting some chains on the snare drum, top head of the snare drum, and every time I rim shot the snare, they bounce up and down. It's like a little... it's a gate for the drum, but it also adds some noise.
I've seen that you add a lot of, like, just, I don't know, stuff to add whatever...
I mean, case in point right here. This is the low snare that you hear that sounds like I'm smashing a wine glass. That has a set of ajouk bells, which are the bells that like a dancer might wear around their ankle or around their wrists.
Oh, okay.
Right? So that's got a set of ajouk bells on top of it, so that it sounds like... I mean, it kind of just sounds like a car crash. And that's the whole point of that sound for me, is to sound like a car crash.
And you're sort of incorporating that live by playing closer to it, or?
No, it's basically strung just above the middle of the head, like across the drum, just above where I strike it. So that the harder I hit it, the more it bounces up, and the more you hear it bounces towards the microphone.
Okay, so you're actually controlling by hitting it harder, because on the other hits, you don't hear it.
So yeah, that's on a low snare that I have to the side in what would normally be like a floor tom position.
Oh, okay, so you're separating by having actual 2 snares.
It's actually 2 different snare drums. One is treated with like this one, which has a T-tail across the top of it, and the ajouk bells. And same deal with this, is that it's actually kind of reverse, but the aesthetic for this turnaround was the car crashes into something, and then you hear the screech of the brakes. It's the wrong way around, but it's just how it happened to come about. So that screech of the brakes in this one is.
I love your brain, man.
Look, you don't want to be there for too long. I'll tell you that much. The screech of the brakes in this case is me duplicating the snare top mic and oh buddy Wobbs, oh Wob over here, doing that. Wobbit. Oh, my mate Wobbit is screeching the brakes. Can we play? Can there be can we do a Brody Simpson signature version of RC20 where Wobble is called Wobbit?
Oh, for sure. We're gonna update everyone's copies now. You're telling us a complete story, like action drama.
This is 100% like this is the way my brain works with this stuff. Is that I want this turnaround to come out of nowhere, and so first time it happens. Right, it comes out of nowhere. There's a whole bunch of sounds that you haven't heard before, and then I go to that slightly more claustrophobic snare sound, as if to say, "Did you hear what I just did?" Right, as if to say, "Hey, lean in a little bit because the thing just happened." So that's the first time it happens. It sounds like this. Right, so it goes to the claustrophobic thing, and then the second time it happens. So a thing that I do, it's almost like a point of pride of like trying to do things in a particular way, is that I like to play the exact same thing twice with one change, so that people know that I'm not looping it.
Right.
So I want it to sound like a loop, but I have to play something slightly different second time around, so it's obvious that I haven't actually just looped it. So second time that turnaround happens, I elongate the kick phrase with that blitzed snare bottom mic to say, yeah, I did the turnaround again, but now I'm making a bigger deal of it.
That is dope.
Hear those bells ringing out off that snare at the end?
Click.
Yeah. So it's a whole production. I mean, it's just drums. What a dickhead. It's just drums. What am I doing?
It's drums are everything. It's just it's everything. At least, I mean, not to everyone, sure. But
No.
the thing is, and we're back to like philosophy here, but there are two things that can make or break a band or any song. It's the drums and the vocals. If you have good vocals and drums, you're pretty much set. And for anyone who doesn't have a good voice, you go with like instrumental music, of course.
Yeah.
But again, people who don't understand like mixing, they do understand what it feels like and if they like it. And usually when people like it, it's because the drums are knocking.
Yeah.
It's just what it is.
I do a thing where I like to instantiate the same plugin on the same slot for every single channel. So I can show you what this sounds like without RC20 on anything, if you want to hear that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure.
Which is this is really, really taking the veil off, and it's ugly.
Well, it does something. I can't really place it, but it does something.
I mean, it's paying for itself there. Should we have a quick look at DS10?
Yeah, sure.
Why not? So I have got it on the kick drum mic a little bit, and all I'm doing with it on the kick drum mic is using the Mojo dial tightness. Big fan of this. So you know how I said I added that reverb to make it sound like a papery front head?
Yeah.
The way for it to actually start to sound like that was to have way too much reverb. So then I needed to use the tightness to get rid of the tail of the reverb.
Right.
So what I'm doing is creating problems for myself and then having to use other plugins to then solve those problems.
What for people who don't use DS10 that much is it's got your regular like attack and sustain dials, so you can control your attack, a lot of attack or less attack, or a lot of sustain, or actually dial back and make something drier.
Yep.
But then it also has got this Mojo dial that is depending on what input you are assigning it to, that is a kick, snare, or the whole drum bus, it would actually like shapes different stuff. So for the kick here, you are controlling the what we call the tightness of the kick.
To me, it's how much blanket you have inside the kick drum is very much what it does, right? Like it.
Right.
It's like, or whether or not you're kind of burying the beater a little bit harder. I don't bury the beater when I play the kick drum, so my kick drum note is often quite long because I don't bury the beater, so I'm not stopping the drum from ringing because I like that sound, but I quite often have to then tame that sound with something like tightness in the Mojo of the DS10 so that it's not quite so resonant, because it can start to get in the way of other elements.
For people who don't know what bearing the beater is when you actually play the kick drum pedal, you can choose to have it hit and then leave the actual skin of the drum so it's resonant, or you can hit it and sort of leave it there so it dampens it, right?
Yeah. And also, with the way I tune my drum, burying the beater raises the pitch of the drum significantly. I will quite often use that to get a second kick drum sound out of my kick drum, where I can have like the longer, lower pitch and then the shorter, slightly higher pitch by burying the beater like really hard.
If people are then using on a snare, you're controlling what we call the snare body.
Actually, I am using a little bit of that on this snare sound.
So what for people who are not maybe thinking about snare body, what would you say you're controlling there?
It adds a little bit of... I feel like it adds a little bit of sustain, actually probably more resonance than sustain. So it's almost like a bit of low mid, which is where your fundamental note is in any drum for the most part. But it adds like a little bit of extra resonance to that. Not so much sustain, trying to make it really long in the way that it's like a very fast release on a compressor, which I guess is kind of what the sustain element of a transient designer does. But yeah, to me it sounds more like a little bit more resonant, and almost as though you've moved the mic just like a centimeter or two closer to get like a little more proximity effect off it. I have used it on many elements in the past to use the it's presence, isn't it, on the bus? Yeah, the presence setting and the Mojo knob when you're on bus, which I've also liked a lot. Maybe
we just thought it was for drums and named it improperly, but I know people use it all the time for vocals or synths or guitars or anything that just needs, where you need more attack or less attack, or more sustain or less sustain, just like to have it bloom a little bit more, or it's just a little bit uncontrolled in like the long tail or whatever. Just use that to then you don't have to do all the automation, or it's more of an easy fix.
I've used it on acoustic guitar before, actually, for exactly that. Yep, for pulling some attack off a particularly percussive sounding acoustic track. Yep.
Yeah, usually that is what people use it for. When you have like a percussive element or something where it's just like the in your face sounds, then just use DS10 a little bit and just dial it back a little bit.
I do find that most plugins sort of shine when you use them where they're not supposed to be used, or where what they weren't designed for, on something they weren't designed for. And I don't know that, like something like RC20, I don't know that was necessarily designed to be used on absolutely every single element of a drum sound at all levels, right? Like
it has definitely started living its own life after release. The way that people like you have started to creatively use it sort of very bespoke, like just a little thing of it on specific things. Yeah, this is why I wanted to just talk to you, because it's now been out so long that it's no longer our plugin. It's like everyone who's using it is using it in their own way, and it's wonderful to see, really.
Yeah. I mean, a plugin that you can easily add a top coat of some sort of aesthetic, some sort of vibe to an overall sound very, very quickly, that's going to get used a lot. And that, I mean, that's what you do with RC20. I mean, even if you just, it opens up on the vinyl preset, you know?
Yeah.
Then you've instantly heard what may have been a boring sound transformed into something that is far from boring. The first video I ever did with RC20, I put it on and I just went, this is the thing that I've been trying to do with so many other things for so long. And I'm pretty sure all I did on that video was put on the vinyl preset. Vinyl 2, I think, maybe.
Right.
And I just went, shit. I've wasted so much time.
I mean, so had we. That's why we built it, really. We just because we also had the same sort of manual, like, stacks of effects. And there's nothing wrong in that, and it's nothing wrong in using like stock plugins and creating your own sauce. But again, it's about workflow. It's like you can do that for a while, and then you're just like, I wanted to make music. I didn't want to be an engineer every day.
Exactly. Yeah. Should we hear it start to finish? Well, actually, I'll tell you what. If I play the whole beat, if anything jumps out that you want to ask about, because I'm boring myself now. I've lived with this guy for way too long. He's not interesting anymore. I'll hit go, see if anything jumps out.
It's so good, Brody. The only thing that jumps out is like, I can't sit still. And the thing about you said where like you don't want to redo the same thing twice is like you are adding interest to every bar. And that's really where I think like if people don't know you, that is what you do. It's like every bar counts.
I hope so. Like, I mean... So much of what I'm doing when I'm doing like the remote session thing, which is, you know, it's essentially my day job, is people send me a track which has loops on it, but they're not drummers. They don't have the same loop, but slight variations of that loop. So the whole song gets a loop on it because that's kind of the overall vibe. And then by the time they get to the bridge, they're like, gee, it'd be nice if the drums weren't the exact same thing they've been for the entire time. And that's kind of where I then come in and play drums on the song, where you can do these kinds of sounds and like, you know, go really hard in it toward a particular aesthetic, but also play a different part if the section requires a different part, which is a really nice thing to be able to do, is to, you know, actually be able to be a drummer and not, you know, not be stuck using sort of a stagnant loop.
I love a good loop. I'm not throwing loops under the bus.
It's what I'm trying to be. I'm trying to be a loop that has the ability to change ever so slightly.
People underestimate what like the little nuances of changing a little like flam or a little thing with a snare or a little ghost note here. I think there is like an innate will to just have something new happen. Even if it is, we're trying to be a loop. Just the fact that you're adding like the randomness factor, that's when like a track becomes interesting.
I think to most people, man, like people want to hear the possibility that a human was involved in the making of something.
Play and have fun with it. Like I think that's what you showed today, is just like where you hear a section like, oh, I could just do a little thing here. Do that. Whenever you have like a little spark of an idea, just try it. And usually, even if it's just for you, you'll hear it. In the end, we're making music for ourselves.
100%.
If you don't like it and you're not going to listen to it on repeat, then why even bother? Try to please yourself first and just be like, oh, this is dope. And usually what happens is everyone else thinks it's really rad too. So on that note, I just urge everyone to pretty much just binge your entire output on Instagram. Thank you for all the insights here. It's just you dropped so many knowledge bombs, and we haven't even gone into other plugins.
I will do that myself when I do my mixing things, actually, which I'm ready to go on.
Tell people about what you got going on in the future.
Yeah, so I'm going to be doing like group live stream mixing. I don't like to use the term masterclass because a master I am not.
That's so just what a master would say.
I am a master of humility. Yeah, so live stream sort of group classes, drum mixing classes, not like drum mixing classes like how to get a kick drum to cut through 18 tracks of guitar, but more like how to make the snare that's sitting next to you sound like a car crash. Which is, the sort of stuff I do here. So basically the sort of stuff that I do as videos, I'm going to kind of go through start to finish, like a mix.
I couldn't urge anyone to get a better sort of birthday gift or, I don't know, gift for the holidays.
Mother's Day? Is this something you give to your mum for Mother's Day?
Just go sign up and get that knowledge dropped on you, because and also you get to hang out with you, which is just a buttload of fun.
I mean, and look, in that setting, it'll only be me. They won't even have the opportunity to talk back to me, so they'll get this, but just relentlessly. So I mean, how could you turn that down? Oh God, it sounds horrific now I explain it.
No. Sounds like the best. But yeah, thank you for your time today. And
thank you.
Again, everyone go follow Brody and sign up for his humble masterclass. All right. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.